So next, looking at some differences between education in China and the West. First, teaching. Obviously, we've described kindergarten, primary school, middle school, and high school, and we can see that the class sizes are quite different. But if you add into that the particular education and culture that you have in China, it means you will see more lecturing and rote learning. In the case of teaching of English, that means that there is a significant influence of things like repetition and drills, getting students to read from their books, to repeat things, to learn to be able to recite things from memory, to memorize vocabulary, and also the use of something that's called the grammar translation method. So I recommend you look up the grammar translation method and its use in China to understand more about those differences. Also, because of class sizes and this culture of using a kind of lecturing style leading from the front, you will see less group work, project work, and also this kind of teaching encourages less critical thinking. It encourages less working by yourselves and solving problems by yourselves. Students tend to be more dependent upon the teacher to deliver the information to them, and the students just need to be there absorbing it during the class and not actually actively seeking new knowledge or new understanding by themselves. Facilities. Schools, you would expect to have at least a playground and probably a running track of some sort around that. And the facilities are going to vary with the age, location, and investment in the school. So some of the teachers who will be teaching in the more distant parts of Shenzhen out to the outskirts may find themselves in brand new schools that may have fantastic facilities. I've been to schools around Shenzhen with brand new swimming pools, with a great array of different musical instruments, with fantastic presentation facilities, touch screens in all of the classrooms that can be linked to iPads, these sorts of things. So depending on what sort of school you find yourself in, you may find yourself with different levels of facilities. But as we said before, investment in education in Shenzhen is really a great focus at the moment, and so you may see great improvements at your school during the time that you're there. PE and sports. So PE is a subject in those two exams that I described earlier, and students would be expected to reach a certain level of fitness and physical ability, doing things like running around the track and throwing a ball a certain distance, that sort of stuff. Recently, in certain areas, the variety of activities that students can enter into to pass these exams has been expanded to include things like swimming. But of course, that will be limited by the availability of different facilities to take part in those activities. Sports teaching in school is on the rise, but in general, you don't see a lot of team sports being taught in schools. So if you have an interest in getting involved in that and you see that your school is showing enthusiasm for that, then I suggest that you get involved and try to support that. I certainly would love to see a lot more sports being taught, a lot more teamwork in the sports world in China would be great to see. I've heard people say that there's kind of an opposition from parents to things like that because quite often with team sports you see injury, and parents might say, well, where is the future in this sport for my child? This isn't golf, this isn't tennis, this isn't something that they can excel as an individual and make lots of money in. So, why would I put time into them doing that? Homework and testing. There are lots of students, so it's quite difficult to get those students to do some more interesting, creative work where the marking is more subjective. Therefore, a lot of tests, quizzes, homework will be done with things where there's an objective measure. So you fill in the blank, there's one correct answer, I can tick that, I can move on to the next question. Or I'm asking a question, a comprehension question about the previous passage, and there is one correct answer that you can find from that passage. Also, this will affect things like the Zhongkao and the Gaokao. And if you are ever asked to help to put on exams or to examine your students, it's worth taking this into account. If you're being asked to put on an oral English exam for 8 classes of grade 1 students, and each class has got 40 or 50 students, that's going to be as much as 400 students you're going to have to do an exam for. So you're going to want to simplify that exam. You're going to want to have a simple marking rubric with clear scores that you can compare your students' ability against and then assign them a fair mark. So you may find yourself having the same challenges that the Chinese examination system has. Responsibility to learn. So I mentioned this earlier with teaching, that the students would be sitting there sort of absorbing the knowledge of the teacher, and that can be seen in the attitudes towards responsibility to learn. There are lots of students, there's a lot of competition, and therefore there's a lot of pressure and emphasis on the students to succeed and do well. Now that seems to contradict what I said about the students just sitting there absorbing information. So this is a distinction between what's happening in the classroom, where the teacher simply doesn't have time to put all of their effort onto each individual student in the classroom, and then what's happening in terms of competition between students. So the students will be trying to work their hardest to do everything that's expected of them and work out what is required to get the highest marks. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're advancing their learning, but it does mean that they're advancing their competition, their competitiveness against other students, so that they can do well in exams and they can excel and get into the best high schools and get into the best universities. And part of that is going to be, the influence of their parents, who will be encouraging them to do very well in those exams, and then trying to help them by getting them into training centers in their spare time and on the weekends, so that they can work on their weaker subjects or they can prepare for exams. Another difference between schools that you might have worked in before in other countries and schools in China is someone that's called a banjuren. Now this literally translates as class director, and this person is something like a class tutor or a form tutor that you might have experienced elsewhere. Their responsibilities range from organizing their class for events, talking to parents, making sure that permissions and things like uniform and photos and health checks and all these kinds of administrative duties are taken care of. But they're also focusing on the actual development of the student, the growth of their students, and the scores that the students get as a whole, as a class. And they will try to create an atmosphere of togetherness, of teamwork between all of the students, so that they're working together and supporting each other, so that as a class they can compete against other classes in their grade as they move through the years at their school. So typically these class directors will stay with their students and move up through the grades in the school following them. And as a result, they may be a subject teacher teaching English or maths or Chinese, and they will follow the students up in the grades as the class director and follow them up through the grades as an English teacher or a Chinese teacher, teaching those grades as they go along. I think this is quite an interesting thing to observe and quite an interesting thing to follow, and it can teach you quite a lot about Chinese culture, so try to observe it and try to understand it. And also I'd suggest you could follow grades at your school as well. So if you want to teach for 2 or 3 years at the same school in Shenzhen, you have an opportunity maybe to work with grades 1, 2 and 3 in the first year, and potentially in your second year you could work with 2, 3 and 4, and that way you're working with the same students and you get a greater sense of achievement and improvement, bringing the students up and helping them with their development as they go along. One final point, the banjuren really is an important figure for each class. So you might be teaching, say, 10 different classes in grade 7. That means there are going to be 10 different banjuren or 10 different class tutors, one for each of those classes. And you're probably going to want to try and develop a relationship with each of one of those people. So if you ever have any problems with individual students in those classes, you know which teacher is in charge of that class, which teacher you can go to and say, hey, this student's not behaving the way that they should do, or this class, something's not right today, what's going on? Of course, you might need the help of an English teacher or someone who can interpret for you, translate, but these guys are going to really care about the performance of their class. And often, if they know that they can talk to you about their class, they're going to want to come to you and ask, oh, how was the class today? Was it good? And you'll probably see them coming in and out of the class and you'll get to know them by face. So it's always worth trying to introduce yourself and trying to communicate with them and trying to show them that you're really enthusiastic about helping them with the development of their class. Next, we'll be looking at expectations. Firstly, the expectations of your school. So, rules. Rules for Chinese teachers will apply to you. So if you're a teacher at a school, you will be expected to behave in the same way as the Chinese teachers. You'll be expected to obey the rules that they obey. So if Chinese teachers are expected to be at the school in the morning all the way till lunchtime, and then from 2 o'clock till 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon, then you should be doing the same thing. Obviously there are other rules like no smoking or drinking. You should be obeying those rules as well. Again, office hours, part of the rules, These will vary, but best to assume that you're going to have them. You can, to some extent, play this by ear and observe the behavior of the other teachers and see what they're doing, but it's always best to assume and err on the side of caution, certainly when you first start at your school. If the school has made it clear to you that they want you to do office hours, it's always best to do them. But if you have some special business that you need to attend to, perhaps to get a residence permit, and you don't have classes on a particular afternoon or for a portion of that afternoon, then schools will often be very understanding and say, okay, in this case, it's fine for you to go away and get that stuff done. Activity classes. Usually you'd expect a school to ask you to take a group of students once a week or maybe more to do some sort of activity. This could be a drama class preparing to put on some kind of play at the end of the semester. It could be anything that you like, potentially. The class might be playing games, or it could be preparing some kind of project like a poster or a magazine. Really, the sky is the limit for what you could do with activity classes. So if you have great ideas for this and you want to share them with the school, more often than not, they can be very welcoming for your ideas, and anything that leads to some kind of performance or some kind of end product is going to be really, really welcome, because schools are particularly keen to draw creativity out of their students to produce events, competitions, and posters and magazines and sort of handicrafts that they can display around the school. So any way you can contribute to that sort of thing will be much appreciated at your school. Events and excursions. So quite often during the year, the school will go out perhaps to a zoo if it's a primary school, or if it's a middle school, they might go out to some kind of team building exercises where they'll have their students working together, trying to do exciting tasks in an outdoors environment. They'll also go off in middle school, certainly. They'll go off for a week to do military training in one semester, and in another semester they'll go off and they'll do lots of traditional handicrafts. And sometimes you'll be invited to join in with these events. So you'll be invited to accompany the students to the zoo or to a theme park. In my case, I was invited to go and observe the students doing their military training, and I was also invited to take part in their cultural handicrafts week as well. So these can be a lot of fun, and it's always better to take part in these because it's what's expected of the Chinese teachers, and so it's what's expected of you as well. And by taking part in that, you're showing that you really identify with the school and you feel like you're part of the team, you're part of the family, and for that reason you'll be treated more in that way and you'll be more accepted. And perhaps, when you need help or you need some more understanding from the school is going to be more on your side. Dress code. I will always advocate overdressing. I like having a collar in a Chinese school, even though you may see Chinese teachers in jeans, a t-shirt and trainers, and maybe even the PE teachers wearing shorts. I always recommend wearing trousers and reasonably smart shoes and some sort of collar. If you want to be smarter than that, I'm not going to stop you. The smarter you are, the better the impression you give, and I genuinely believe it affects the behavior of your students. The school, their expectations specifically will vary from school to school, and it's best to follow the teacher's example if you have any sort of confusion about what is expected. If you're working in a kindergarten, I will always advise you to not show too much flesh, and also if you have significant tattoos, it's always best to cover those up because certain people in China may frown on that sort of thing, and rather than get into a philosophical argument with someone who doesn't speak your native language, it's probably best to just err on the side of caution and avoid that confrontation altogether. Other expectations. So student expectations of foreign teacher classes. So if you look at the picture over here on the right, try to identify who I might be thinking of as foreign teachers in China. Very quickly you'll spot the odd ones out. There's a monkey at the back here, and there's a clown down the front here. Very often when I've taught as a foreign teacher in China, I've felt more like a performing clown than a proper teacher. I'm given a large audience, 60 or more students, and I've got to keep them entertained for 40 or 45 minutes. Why do I feel like that? Why did that happen? So the reasons for the students, it's previous experience in a lot of cases. They've been taught by teachers who will use a lot of games and videos and music, And those activities in and of themselves are not necessarily bad things to use in the classroom, but perhaps they've been used in a slightly irresponsible way as methods to kill time during the class, methods to get to the end of the lesson. Whereas they should really be used as ways of priming language, of drawing ideas out of the students and getting them to use the language and getting them to practice the language. So if you are following in the footsteps of a teacher who had fairly low standards in terms of getting the students to learn and to focus, then that may have a negative impact on the way that they treat you, on their expectations for you. Another thing to take into account is the students will rarely have homework for a foreign teachers class. And that means they don't have a huge incentive from them grades to actually engage with the class and make sure that they put a lot of effort into it. So you don't have that to control them to some extent. And an extra aspect of that is that often they will not be examined, or even if they are examined, the results of that exam will not be particularly important to them. So whilst they are spending a lot of time learning English and working on English, they'll have one period a week with you, and that will almost seem to them like it's fun time, like it's a break from doing their normal classes. Now that in and of itself isn't a big issue if you can harness that enthusiasm, the joy that the students will bring to your class at thinking, okay, I'm going to have a little bit more fun in this class. It's going to be a bit more free and easy. You can't get away from that expectation. You can't fully change the fact that students are going to come to your class thinking, okay, I'm going to have a bit of fun here. But you can harness that energy and enthusiasm, and you can use games and you can use songs and videos and put them together with other more controlled and structured activities to lead the students to practice the language in a fun and engaging way. And that way you can turn yourself from a clown into a really effective, fun teacher. Other expectations. I think it's important to put this in here. There is a pervasive attitude in Asia, I think, and it's certainly true in China, that a foreigner looks a certain way. So an English speaker should look like a stereotypically English person. So they should have white skin, blonde hair and blue eyes. Now obviously coming from the West, we all know that English speakers have all different kinds of appearances. And it's really important, I think, to highlight this because we have all sorts of teachers coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, and you may be shocked at some of the things that you hear and some of the things that people say. You may, once you've learnt a little bit of Chinese, you might hear people saying things about you that you just think, well, that's just plain ignorant and that's not acceptable. And that's really the point here. It is a lot of ignorance. These stereotypes that are drawn, for example, that black people come from Africa, or that anyone that looks remotely Asian might be Chinese or Japanese. These are based on not having seen a lot of foreigners, not being exposed to a lot of the world, and not really reading very widely, not receiving a very balanced education. And we must take these things into account when we come up against people that present these very challenging opinions and views to us. As someone who's worked in China for several years, I've been exasperated by the attitudes that people have when they're telling me, oh, this person, their English can't be good because look at the color of their skin. And so, you have to find flexible, patient, understanding ways to get around these issues and understand that a lot of the time, no offense is meant. These are genuinely held beliefs and opinions about what an English speaker should look like, or perhaps what a good English speaker should sound like. And we need to understand that it's going to take time to change these attitudes. And certainly at SDE, we're committed to championing teachers of all sorts of different backgrounds to break down these stereotypes. Finally, we're going to take a look at discipline and learning disabilities in Chinese schools. The first thing to look at here is the teaching assistants. Now, as I said before, kindergartens will provide teaching assistants almost always. However, when you get into primary school, whilst some schools will provide teaching assistants for grades 1 and 2 because the students are so young, it's not something that you're guaranteed to get, and it's not something that schools are required to provide. So whilst it is a nice helping hand that you might receive, you should be prepared to have to deal with 50 plus primary school students by yourselves, or certainly in the case of middle school or high school, there's no chance that you're going to get a teaching assistant there. So you need to have some very good, well thought out classroom management methods. One way to deal with this is to set rules, set them very early on and stick to them and keep reinforcing them week in, week out. You can also go and see how Chinese teachers are disciplining their students, and you can talk obviously to our teachers and get some of our methods, get some of our ideas. Next, it's worth pointing out what the limitations are here. So corporal punishment is not allowed, and standing up or making students stand outside the class is also just not really advised, and certainly some schools will say it's not allowed at all. So be aware of these limitations. It may not come as a great surprise that corporal punishment is not allowed. However, you might see a teacher strike a student. You might see something that you think is unacceptable. In other terms, you might see teachers shouting for long periods of time at their students or getting them to do things that you might think are unreasonable. In these situations, it's always best to ask polite questions to find out what's going on and not jump to any conclusions about whether something is or isn't acceptable. And if you have any concerns about the way that certain teachers are treating their students, raise those concerns to us first and get us involved. If you need any help with a particular class, as we said before, the class teacher or the banjuren is a very valuable ally to call upon. You could also think about the English teacher for that particular class, because every single class will have an English teacher, and sometimes that English teacher will also be the class tutor. So think about who you know that also has to deal with that class, because there will be other teachers, and get in touch with them and ask them for help or advice on how to discipline the students. At the same time, as I've said before, you can call upon us as well. Talk to your specialist, talk to your academic consultant, and see what help we can provide as well. Finally, learning disabilities. So on occasion, you may find that you have a student in a class who is somewhat isolated or seems to be behaving in a rather erratic manner, and you may believe that there is some kind of learning disability involved, or it may be obvious that there's a learning disability because there's always an adult accompanying this child in the class, or the parents are often taking them out of class or something like this. It's very important at this stage to state that very few of us are actually experts in how to deal with these issues, and there are very few experts in Chinese schools as well. The level of education of the teachers is not up to what you might expect in your home country. There is a system of training for Chinese teachers, but a lot of them will have not received the full training yet, because a lot of the teachers will be quite new to teaching or may simply not have enough time to take that training. And also the resources to help students who have learning disabilities are quite limited. So if you come across a challenging student and you feel that disrupting your class, then please be sensitive to the situation, understand there are limits to what can be done. Try to deal with it by talking to class tutors, English teachers, and talking to the specialist and talking to us, and we'll help you to deal with it the best that we can. If you have any kind of expertise in dealing with learning disabilities, please let us know. We'd be interested. And also you could talk to the school, but be prepared that the parents may not be overly enthusiastic about confronting the issue, and it may require a lot of sensitivity and patience to provide help to a student. Quite often in China, parents are unwilling to accept that there is some kind of learning disability because they believe it will reflect badly upon them. They believe that it will indicate that they've done something wrong in raising their kid, even though that's not necessarily the case. So in conclusion, it's important to realize that what is acceptable for discipline and how these things are handled may not be different from your own experience, and also that learning disabilities cannot be dealt with in exactly the same way as they would be in your own country. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. Up next, we'll be talking about lesson planning.